Okay, this is one that I just received this email, I think this week. And this is a question that I have gotten before. And I know I've addressed it in different contexts, but this will at least give me an opportunity to have like a separate video I can post of this question. So that is in terms of preaching. Does preaching always need to follow a law then gospel structure? And so there are certain, if you look in my book Lex Eterna, I do discuss this, which is a discussion of law and gospel. And there's a section on practical theology and how to apply law and gospel at the end of that. In that chapter, I deal with a contemporary Lutheran primer on preaching that basically says this. So there are some Lutherans who basically say every sermon needs to follow this structure. And law and gospel is a sermon structure where you have basically you present the law, then you end with the gospel. So I don't know how you want to divide it up. 50% law, you preach for 20 minutes, you got 10 minutes law, 10 minutes gospel, and you're done. And that has to be followed every single time. I think that's completely wrong. And that doesn't mean that you should never preach that way. But what you need to do is preach the text. If you look at historic Lutheran theology and preaching, look at older Lutheran sermons, they're not just law then gospel. And I think even if you read Walther's sermons, read a volume of Walther's sermons, and I think that many modern Lutheran pastors who call themselves heirs of Walther, specifically on law and gospel, would say that Walther himself confuses law and gospel in those sermons. So I think the reason is because we've really misunderstood what the function and purpose of the law-gospel distinction is in a lot of ways. And we have made law and gospel just this paradigm for doing theology and preaching and absolutely everything. And you see this in someone like Oswald Bayer, who very much promotes this idea that the essence of theology is law and gospel in a way. Everything is the address of God to man and man back to God, as he speaks about it. That's why he says God is the justifying God and man is the sinful man. So we have to speak of man as sinful man, God as justifying God. And these are not just accidental features. These are of the essence of God and man, which is a very confusing way of speaking. But this is what you have when you have basically a law gospel reductionism, and you can't speak about any traditional theological categories. So preaching then becomes just law and gospel, or as some people would say, it's just the extended absolution. And the idea is this is all about for you proclamation, as Gerhard Forde says in Theologies for Proclamation, which is that the preaching is always what he calls first. Well, he doesn't even actually say this, to be honest, because what people say today in Forde's tradition is that preaching always has to be this, what he calls primary discourse. So Forde says primary discourse is delivering the goods, or this, we speak directly to you, so you are forgiven. That's primary discourse. It is speech that actually does something. This is tied to John Austin and speech act theory and all this other stuff. So that when I am preaching, I am delivering God's gifts to you, and there's a for you element of preaching, which there is a for you element of preaching, of course, because that's part and parcel of Luther and the Reformation and Lutheran thought. That's part of what distinguishes Lutheranism from other traditions, is the emphasis on the for you of the gospel. So I'm by no means saying that's not good. That's very good. And if you've ever heard my own preaching, I do a lot of for you proclamation. But it's this idea that it has to be in this mode of address, me to you. And what Forde would say is anything else is talking about the gospel. So if you're saying anything other than basically you're forgiven, I forgive you, you are just talking about the gospel, which he calls secondary discourse. Now, what Forde actually says, he actually says that you don't have to do primary discourse in every sermon. Which is interesting because Forde students would never say that. But so what a lot of Forde students say that I encounter in a lot of these discussions is the sermon is all about the for you proclamation, primary discourse, and that's it. Any secondary discourse kind of stuff, yeah, it maybe is there in the background a little bit, But you really have to kind of get through all of the other stuff to just get to the main point, which is you are forgiven. You are a sinner, you're forgiven. The end. So what that does is it truncates the sermon so that there really isn't a lot of doctrinal exposition in the sermon at all. There's not really a lot of grammatical, historical context. There's not really a lot of exegesis in the sermon. In some ways, I've heard preachers from this perspective. I mean, it to some extent, it doesn't matter what they're preaching. Like it really could matter. It doesn't matter what text they're actually talking about because they've already decided what they're going to talk about. And so the text is just kind of there as a background. So they might spend 3 minutes talking about the text, giving a story, something else, and then they just get to what they really want to say, which is the same thing they say every week, which is you're forgiven. So it's this extended absolution. There are so many problems with that. If you go back and look at things like, Luther's Large Catechism, you realize, wait a minute, those are actually sermons that he preached, and they're catechetical sermons, and they're sermons that are on the Ten Commandments. There are sermons that are actually telling you, hey, you're supposed to do things like obey God's law. And if you read someone like Petrus Naxgau, who's a great Lutheran theologian, we've got a volume of his sermons that's a systematic theology. He's got a systematic theology that's sermons because he's giving doctrinal exposition. And it doesn't mean there's no For You gospel in there, but he actually saw it as something you could do as sermons. Now, I'm not saying your sermons should be systematic theology lectures, but my point is that's how much Lutheran preaching and practice has changed. So that at one time there was so much exposition, there was so much attention to what does Scripture say, what does Scripture mean, and this is why when you read Walther, he says, sermons should be no more than 3/4 of an hour, as in sermons were 45 minutes at the time in a Lutheran congregation. And what I've seen, especially in these kind of more Furdy influenced preaching styles, is the sermons get shorter and shorter because they have nothing to say. And so I've been in a Lutheran service where the sermon's 6 minutes long because the pastor has nothing to say. Because they just, basically, they're filling up 5 minutes so they can just get to you're forgiven and give an absolution. I mean, if that's the case, what's the point of the sermon? Just give an absolution and don't even do the sermon, because it's the same thing again. You're just telling a story, you're doing something to just get through whatever you need to so you can get to the real point of it. So when your sermon's 45 minutes long, you can't do that. You've got to do a lot more. And so the distinction between law and gospel is so essential for preaching. But it's not a sermon structure. It means that you take the text, you preach what's in the text, and the law and gospel helps you to apply the text. And so you do have to ask yourself, is this law? Is this gospel here? How am I going to speak this word to these people? How do they need to hear this law that is in the text? What is a way that I can communicate God's demands to these particular people in this particular context? What is a way that I can preach the gospel that's very explicitly going to address the law that's been preached and that's clear in this text? And so you do distinguish law and gospel, and it pretty much should be the case that both law and gospel are in every sermon. Pretty much. There probably are instances in which that's not the case, but for the most part, every sermon should have law and gospel in it. I've never preached a sermon without the law or the gospel. I include both of them in every sermon. They're going to be different, though. Some are more law heavy, some are more gospel heavy. That all kind of depends on the context. It depends on where your congregation's at. It depends on what the needs are. It depends on what's going on at the moment. When there has been a major death in a congregation, or some kind of tragedy that's hit a congregation, like we had horrible flooding in our church, I'm not going to get up that Sunday when everybody's really struggling and just give a bunch of law and make everybody feel bad. So there's a context of this is going to be mostly gospel because that's what these people need right now. So that comes from both pastoral experience, what's going on in the congregation, what's going on even in the world at the moment, and what's in the text. So I would say if you do get a text that's only law, which does happen on occasion, at that point, I would say I don't think you should just stick to law, but I think you should apply the gospel too, but apply it in a way that's relevant to the text and specifically very relevant to the law that you just preached, so that it does connect with the text. And the reason I say that is because if you actually look through the New Testament and you read, there's no law apart from gospel, because the books of the New Testament, think about the epistles, these are to be read at once. So it's not like there's an instance where someone writes a whole epistle, Paul's like, oh, here's my law epistle, and you read this on a Sunday morning, it's all law. Every time there is law, there is gospel connected to it somewhere. And so that does, I think, give us a precedent to say we need to be doing that too. So generally, yes, if there is no gospel explicit in the text that you're preaching, I still think you should bring the gospel in, because the gospel is relevant to everything. So yes, law and gospel, hugely essential to sermons, hugely essential to pastoral care, but they are not meant to be a sermon structure. Lutherans never saw it that way. Luther's own sermons, they do not follow that structure. Sometimes they can follow that structure. Oftentimes they don't. The New Testament doesn't just strictly follow that structure. Church history has never just explicitly followed that structure. This is a new development. It's what I would call reductionism, law-gospel reductionism. And I think we can do a lot better than this. So we need to be proclaiming law and gospel and distinguishing law and gospel, but doing it in a way that is actually consistent with our theology and actually consistent with the text of Scripture itself.